Welcome to EHO Knows. I've already filmed this podcast, so I know what's going on. It's a ripper. It's talking about one of the topics that I find absolutely fascinating, absolutely horrific. It is totally commonplace and yet so poorly done. We're going to be talking about hand washing, cross-contamination, and to do it, we're going to be having someone on who, in the dim, dark past, was an environmental health officer. He's since moved on and established his business that is literally about cleaning up the world and has been hugely successful at that. But despite what's going on in his business, you will catch him at conference after conference, be it a medical conference, environmental health conferences. And he is so active at the moment, still supporting the environmental health at organisation level, individual level. So today's EHO Knows, total legend. It used to be Greg Whiteley, Dr. Greg Whiteley, Professor Greg Whiteley. Welcome to EHO Knows.
Shane, thank you so much for having me on, and thank you to your podcast recipients, whether they're listeners or watchers, and I'm really thrilled to be here and look forward to the discussion.
So hand washing, how essential is it?
A great place to start. So I want to take you back a little way. And it's some really probably high school work these days, but certainly first year undergraduate work, is you have to go back to when microscopes were invented. Before microscopes were invented, no one knew about the invisible world of microbiology. It was all just miasma and mystery. And, you see early drawings of how to solve problems with pandemics, and you had the great big mask with the cotton wool jammed up to try and, filter out bugs. But we now know, and bugs are part of our normal world, that the bugs we worry about primarily transfer between people in one of two ways. The first and obvious way, particularly in the post-COVID period, is via respiratory pathways. So small particles in the air, someone coughing, someone sneezing. Sometimes they're suspended for a long time, sometimes not, depends on the size of the particles. But you need to get a sufficient number of those particles to actually contract, if you will, the illness associated. The other primary means of spread is actually via these little things. These are the magical hands of death. I had the late friend of ours, the late Professor Mary Louise McClaws, gave a talk once that said, it was to a bunch of medicos, and she called it killing them softly, because they were really bad at washing their hands. And bugs move around on hands. You can't see them, but they're there. And we now know from work we've done and research that's been published that when you touch any of these infectious microorganisms, even in a biofilm, which we'll come back to on a surface, those bugs stay on your fingers or hands for up to 19 subsequent touches. So they're falling off in diminishing amounts for the 19 subsequent touches. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think that a healthcare worker might go from place A to place B to place C to then go to a patient, if they've picked up those bugs in place B, but they washed their hands in place A, but didn't do it between B and C and when they touched the patient, those bugs have moved from whatever it was they touched, and they're now on the patient. And the same applies in the food sector. You'll often see someone will go and hopefully wash their hands after having a cigarette. They're touching their mouth. There's all these oral pathogens and they're inhaling. They're all over their hands, and they go and they wash their hands and then they dry it on some filthy rag. There's more bugs on the filthy rag than there is their mouth, or certainly as many. So hand hygiene is a critical part of what we call infection prevention. So it breaks the transmission cycle. And if you get it wrong, the transmission cycle can be continued.
Okay, so hospitality, you go to the toilet, you don't wash your hands. And so what you're effectively saying is that the next 20 things that you touch when you step back into the commercial kitchen, you're now potentially contaminating.
Sure. Let me tell you, it's worse than that. Because you want to wash your hands, so you go out and you grab hold of the toilet room door, the bathroom door, but the dirty bugger behind you or in front of you, she didn't wash their hands, and all their fecal oral germs are actually on that toilet handle. So part of the challenge is having a hand washing location sufficiently close to the food preparation area that you can break the cycle. So you might have done the right thing, but if the person before you didn't, then their germs, which are just as dangerous, potentially, are the ones that are on your hands now and move to the food preparation area.
Yeah. Okay. So tangent. Yeah. I go to the shops. I go to the bathroom just before eating. And so I'm now going through the door and then I'm about to eat. And so from a personal point of view, then the biggest risk factor is actually going to the toilet, being cross-contaminated by someone else. So that last minute hand hygiene, the hand sanitizer before I eat my sandwich is then absolutely essential for getting over what I've just contaminated myself with.
Pretty well, yes.
Yeah.
You know, that's really important for people that are worried about. And look, sometimes the context is everything, Shane. You know, germs are part of our life. I mean, we share germs with each other anyway, shaking hands, hugging one another, kissing a baby that might be your grandson or granddaughter, you know, having them kiss you. They're bugs, you know, it's all two ways. That's part of life.
And the argument there is that that's actually part of boosting our communal immunity.
Absolutely. There was a theory around that said that antimicrobial resistance was caused by what's called the hygiene theory. And the whole explosion of immune problems was a thing called the hygiene theory. People were too clean. Well, that's just rubbish. You can't get that clean unless you're going to live in a bubble. Yeah, look, germs are part of life. So it's not about being a germaphobe. It's really about the context of things. You can be as strict or as diligent as you wish. You're going to have germs come from the community, whether you like it or not. And having germs come from the community boosts your immunity. You know, and that's a normal part of life. But hand hygiene in the right context, that's all about making sure that the germs that you've got on your hands don't get onto, particularly in the context of food preparation surfaces, in the context of healthcare, moving germs from another patient via a surface to another patient or via yourself onto a patient.
Yeah. Being devil's advocate, though, if a little bit of this is good, then why do we bother? Say, let's stick with hospitality first of all. Why bother at all? Well, you know, surely just a little bit of fecal matter here and there isn't that bad. It happens naturally. You know, let's just boost the immunity of the community.
Some people might like it. You know, it depends on your context. The thing with bacteria particularly, but funguses equally, and in some rare cases viruses, in the context of food, they get on the food and they don't stay dormant. They actually multiply. And so the context of food preparation is if you can stop those fecal orals getting onto the food, then the chances of those bacteria in particular multiplying and therefore causing a food-related illness are dramatically diminished. Salmonella is the classic one. Someone who has salmonella, I mean, the old story about typhoid, Mary had typhoid. She continued to exude typhoid throughout her life, apparently. You know, she got near food and the bacteria went, yay, here we go. Well, keep multiplying and everyone gets typhoid. Well, that's not a happy day for anybody, particularly for those that die. Salmonella, of course, and we're worried about some variants of salmonella more than others. Some will cause a fatal illness. Context is also everything. Sometimes it's actually the vulnerability of the patient, not just the pathogenicity of the bug. That is to say, the bug might affect you and I much the same way. We might get ill and a bit of vomiting and diarrhea, but if old Mr. Jones or old Mrs. Smith gets that bug, it might cause their bowel to rupture and they die. Now, that's a pretty bad outcome, fortunately rare, but it's not unheard of. And that's the importance of the hand hygiene issue. Let me give you one other thing too. This turned up in an EHO context. I actually was involved in giving advice at one stage because the old rules about hand hygiene are you have to have soap and water. And if you go back, particularly before the HIV pandemic, so we're now talking the early 80s, most of the hand hygiene was done using systems using chemistries called chlorhexidine gluconate. They're quaternary ammonium biocides, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, they're a soap and water.
They're technical terms, aren't they? Blah, blah, blah.
Blah, blah, blah is a technical term to mean everything else that is in the blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But, they're pretty effective, but they work rather slowly. If you do microbiology with those things, they certainly need 30 seconds, and really they probably need 2 to 5 minutes to have their full effect. And of course, if you've ever seen anybody wash their hands, unless there's surgeons about to operate, there's no way they're going to spend 5 minutes. It's hard enough to get people to realise they have to use soap with the water, and water alone is not enough. But then following HIV, there was a realisation, particularly with the alcohol products, these things work really quickly. And in Australia in particular, there's actually, and this is not well known amongst the EHOs, there's actually 2 types of these products. One type is the things you buy through the retail supermarkets or at the newsagent or whatever. They're usually got 70% of ethanol in them. There's other materials they can use, and a small amount of what's called an emollient or skin softener. And after COVID, those things exploded. They come in. But if you use them more than 2 or 3 times, they just about destroy your hands. Not all of the products, but particularly the cheapies. The second group of the products are actually classed as medicines. And those products are made under strict pharmaceutical manufacturing conditions and have very expensive, extensive pre-market approvals to go through before they're even allowed onto the market. And those products are sold almost exclusively into the healthcare marketplace. And in that context, the emollients that are used as skin softeners are much more sophisticated. And the reason for that is an intensive care nurse who follows the international protocol called 5 moments of hand hygiene during a standard shift will wash her hands anywhere between 180 and 260 times per shift. Now, that's a lot of hand hygiene. So if you're using one of those cheap, crappy products, your hands will be destroyed in no time at all. Either that or they'll be so thick and leathery that you almost lose tactile sensation. So, there's an important distinction, but those medical products are actually meant to be used in 30 seconds, and they're much faster than the old style wash your hands with soap and water. So what we tend to have, particularly in healthcare now, but it's finding its way into other areas, is if your hands are grossly contaminated, in the food context, you've got bits of cooking material or oils or some sort of, you'd be cutting up raw meat, then you wash your hands with soap and water and get rid of all of the stuff off your hands, which will also generally remove 99.9% of the germs. Won't kill them all, but most of them are gone. Whereas if your hands are not visibly soiled, then these alcohol-based hand rubs are a really helpful and completely efficacious alternative. And the advice I had to give was in the context of someone running actually a therapeutic massage cum physiotherapy clinic. And they were being forced to put in SAPs, sinks and so forth next to every bed. And I said, well, that's just crazy. I mean, if you're going to use massage oil, yeah, fair enough, go and wash your hands. But if you're touching a patient, then really the alcohol-based hand rubs, absolutely sufficient and completely therapeutic and efficacious, approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration.
And it's a tangent, sorry, EHOs, but a lot of water in a medical environment then isn't good either, because now you've got a very wet environment where you're splashing all over the place. So potentially is hand washing even worse if you were using it continually and splashing around, or rather than just having hand sanitizer on the door?
No, actually the worst thing is those hand dryers. The hand dryers are fantastic for aspirating the bugs all over the place. I mean, if you really, those automatic hand dryers, if you want to spread the bugs quickly, you get one of those ones, particularly the cheaper ones that blow it down into a puddle and then the water is blowing them everywhere. You can measure E. coli all over the ceiling if you need to from those.
So the number of ones where
E. coli is not going to be much of a risk on the ceiling. I mean, I'm not going to climb up on the ceiling and lick the ceiling to get infected, but it's about that. So, yeah, look, the context of water in hospitals is important. Actually, the other one that you haven't quite hit on, but let me go there, is if you've got the faucet directly emptying into the drain plug, you'll get a lot of aspiration, and the material in the drain is always contaminated. There are wet biofilms there. There's all manner of bugs. Everything that you've washed off your hands has gone down there and living quite happily. We find often in healthcare that you will get outbreaks, particularly with gram-negative organisms, things like Pseudomonas, Burkholderia, Serratia, 3 very common ones. And so what happens is someone's washing their hands or maybe cleaning something they shouldn't be cleaning in a hand washing basin, and it gets recontaminated with the bugs in the plug hole, basically. So, yeah, water in healthcare is a bit of an issue. It is in food. You really don't want
Okay, so jumping back to hospitality then, you've got places that are cleaning food in the hand washing basin, and then you've got it contaminating the basin. But what you're saying is that if they were just squirting that straight down into the plug hole, you're now just vaporizing stuff everywhere anyway. So
absolutely. It's being
a double whammy.
Absolutely. It's being turned into a fine mist that spreads all over the place. But as I say, look, if you want to look at the most common things that happen in the food sector, even when they do wash their hands, is they then go and dry them on some dirty, filthy rag rather than using disposable towel. And if you are going to have people washing their hands, you need to make sure you've got through the process of how they're going to do the drying. And because if they're using the filthy towel, there was one outbreak I remember when I was working as an EHO back in the dim dark ages, where there was a chicken shop in the centre of Sydney, or a sandwich shop, and the same towel that they were cleaning the bench with, and there was raw meat on the bench. They were also using occasionally to dry their hands, and the raw meat infected the cooked chicken, which went into sandwiches that made people sick. And when the EHOs turned up, they found the contamination as much as anything else on insufficiently washed cutting boards and on this rag or series of rags that were used to wipe things down and dry stuff with.
How bad can a rag get? Have they done research on like a tea towel in a restaurant?
There's nothing recent because we all know it so well. I mean, it's the sort of thing you give to a final-year undergraduate project. Go and get some tea towels and see how they go, or contaminate them in the lab is the easiest way. You can simulate that in a lab experience pretty quickly. It's not hard to show.
Okay, then what's still a common practice is wiping down tables in restaurants. Like you watch them just going table to table. What's the good, the bad, the ugly there?
Oh my God. They start in the toilet. I've got my cleaning cart, so I'm in the food service. I'm going to do all the tables in the food service, area where people are sitting down. But hang on a minute, I'll do the restrooms first. So they're going to do the bathrooms and the same rags, and it's the same cleaning material. It's just like, please kill me. No. And as they're trying to kill all the restaurant patrons anyway. That's probably the best place to start. One of the funny areas, and we're still doing research in this area with wiping. Now in fact, I had a paper published one time where one of the peer reviewers said to me in the peer review, it's not that hard. You just wipe a surface. And there are 9 variables in wiping a surface aseptically. 9 variables. And this reviewer said, you only need to control the wiping. And I'm like, what part of the wiping? So you and I are fit, young, healthy males, been at the gym, and now we're going to wipe something down. I've just been bench pressing my 2 kilos, feeling really fit for it. I get out and I wipe the bench down. Well, I've got I'm just on 6 feet using the old scale, 182 centimeters, 95 kilos. I can use a fair amount of weight as downward pressure. If you're a, small person from part of the world, possibly female, I'm not meaning to be too gender specific, but it's useful for this illustration. And you're only using the old scale 5'1", and you weigh 48 kilos. Unless you're a world championship wrestler for your weight for age range, you're probably not going to have quite as much energy to have the same downward pressure. Now, if you're tasked with wiping 100 things in an hour, by the end of the 7th hour, you're probably not using the same amount of downward pressure. And that's classically the problem with cleaning. People think it's such a straightforward thing, but when you think in terms of microbiology and hygiene, we're now looking at a microbiological level. We're not looking at just making sure that the visible dust is removed. I mean, that's great. And, if you've used a nice smelling detergent so it smells clean, that's great. And for a lot of people, they think, well, we'll use bleach. Well, actually, that's worse, because bleach, when it dries, forms a very different sort of biofilm that forms basically a chemically resistant barrier where it basically ceases to work. So it still smells like bleach, but it hasn't killed the bugs. So wiping's really an interesting area. And look, it's an area for us where active research is going on, where we've got a current grant application in. I'm not sure whether it'll get up, but we're hoping to have one of our postdoctoral researchers who's a biofilm researcher come in and do a whole pile of work in specifically this area of looking at wiping surfaces, particularly in the food preparation context.
So what were the other factors then? So
downward
you got pressure,
speed of wipe,
I assume.
What's the wiping material? And there's all sorts of wiping materials. Is it dry or wet? What's the subsurface material you're cleaning? I can't remember them all. I'll do my best. What's the subsurface material you're cleaning? Because obviously, if you're cleaning a wooden desktop, that's a very different surface from, say, a polished stone versus very different surface from, say, a slightly pocked corium surface, versus something that's got cuts in it or grazes or scratches. So subsurface is important. Are you using a disinfectant cleaner or a cleaning material? Are you doing pre-wetting of the surface, spraying it, then wiping it? Or are you just wiping it? And then when you put those combination factors together, so are you using, it's a dry surface with a wet wipe, or is it a wet surface that you've pre-wet that you used a dry wipe? Or if you pre-wet the surface with a wet wipe and then clean. So it actually is complex, believe it or not. And the bit that I've, alluded to is this new area called biofilms. Biofilms, when I did micro back at Hawkesbury Ag and Environmental Health back in the 80s with a guy called Dr. Ron Proudfoot, lovely bloke. Biofilms, no one knew what they were. The term hadn't been invented. It was actually invented by a guy called William Costerton, who is the late Professor William Costerton, lovely man, taught at the University of Montana in Bozeman campus. And he observed these things, and his context initially was wet biofilms because he's up in this beautiful area of the US. And he observed there was, when you first put a rock into a creek, it was clean. But as time went on, particularly in a still pond, it would grow. And what was the first thing that grabbed hold of the stone to grow? Well, it was actually bacteria. If you look at the intertidal zone at the headland at the end of the beach, you'll see there's transition of biofilms down to wet biofilms under the low tide mark where all the seaweed grows. But what's the common factor there is bacteria attaching to surfaces. If you look on a cliff face, particularly in Australia south facing, that gets water, you'll see all sorts of algae and lichens and so forth. On the other cliff face, if it's road cuttings, and that's a north-facing cliff face, it'll largely be clean because the bacteria can't grow as well. And there's a wet biofilm on this other side. Now, when that comes back into our EHO context, away from even the environmental ramifications of that, which there are many, and they're hugely significant environmentally, bring it back into the food context, obviously, as you alluded to before, lots of water means lots of bugs and lots of risk. But we now know through work again that we pioneered globally that you also get, particularly in healthcare, but it also is true in food services, food preparation centers. You get dry biofilms, where some of the bugs basically work on creating their own biofilms. Here's where it gets really interesting, which is relevant for EHOs. My theory, and it was my theory, was after HIV in the 80s, the amount of antimicrobial resistance exploded. Not just because we were, prescribing more antibiotics. In fact, the amount of antibiotics exploded after that as well, the range and proliferation of different types. But in hospitals in particular, we saw this massive lift up in the number of what we now call healthcare associated infections. And my hypothesis was that the bugs as they've evolved have worked out how hospital cleaning is done. And of course, one of the things that came out of HIV was a thing called universal precautions, in which it basically said all you need is a neutral detergent and chlorine. And my hypothesis was the bugs have worked it all out, because when you see how the cleaning's done, basically all the cleaner normally does with the neutral detergent is give them a wash and a feed. I mean, they're sloshing the stuff around, and all the cracks and crevices fill up with all the stuff they didn't pick up because they partially solubilize the fats and it all falls in the cracks. And then the chlorine comes off and seals them off, and then as it starts to dry, the bugs open up. Well, we now have taken that research all off. We've proven that hypothesis, basically, that if you do your cleaning badly, you create environments, microenvironments, where the bugs go into this biofilm state. From a healthcare point of view, once they're in a biofilm state, the bugs are 200 times at least more resistant to antibiotics. The non-healthcare side, for the dry surfaces, which is partially healthcare, but also in the food area, we've shown that, for example, that a standard Staph aureus, once it's in a dry surface biofilm, will be 10,000 times more resistant to chlorine disinfectants, for example. And you sort of go, well, if you want to disinfect your pool, you use 1 milligram per litre of an available chlorine. What we showed was once you put them in these dry biofilms, they'll resist 20,000 milligrams per litre of active chlorine.
Yeah.
That's pretty significant. And no one would think of pouring 20,000 milligrams per litre of chlorine into their pool because it'd burn your eyes out. But that's what the bugs can do, because they evolve resistance, they evolve what's going on. And the best, most recent example of that was actually SARS, both SARS-1 and COVID, which was SARS-2, because both those bugs, which started in a very limited way, SARS-1 was, we don't know really where it came out of, which animal group it came out of, but it started basically in a residential building in Hong Kong. And it recirculated inside the residential building and just built up strength and increased its pathogenicity until finally it was so infectious that it broke out. The funny thing with that is, even though it was so infectious, there were only ever 880 people recorded as infected. They're quite a small number. Now, you compare that to SARS-2, so-called COVID, and let's leave aside whether it came from a lab or initially or an animal, and because science is a little bit caught up on that, although I think it probably falls more on the lab side than anything else. Not intended necessarily, more likely inadvertently, but there's some pretty strong genetic evidence about that. Not 100% by any means. But of course, what we think happened there was, again, it was circulating in this population, particularly with the humans, because there were reports from that laboratory of an undiagnosed or unidentified respiratory illness. Remembering SARS is a type of what's called a coronavirus. Coronaviruses are one of the many families of viruses that cause common colds. So, people just had a bad cold. It was winter, for goodness sake, in the Northern Hemisphere. In China, it was cold, and they're getting colds. No one thought it, but somehow or other got into the food market at Wuhan. And we're not sure, again, which animals it went into and out of, but it got concentrated up. And then it showed that it could jump species. But once it jumped species, particularly they think into the penguins, which are a type of a cat, as I recall, it then again concentrated itself up and jumped back into the general population. And off it went. And of course, it affected, 100 million people, 200 million people? We really don't have a hard number. WHO really doesn't have a hard number, but it's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. And a lot of people died. Again, that's what bugs do. And that was a virus, but the bacteria do it just as well. And the funny thing is, there are still more people dying in Australian hospitals from multi-drug resistant bacteria than from these horrible respiratory viruses. And it's not that there's not an insignificant number of people die from these horrible respiratory viruses as well. The point is, infectious organisms, when they break out, we need to work out how to break the cycle. And for most of what we're doing in EHO work, hand hygiene is a cornerstone. Surface hygiene equally, we were talking about cleaning, surface hygiene equally, super important. In one sense, it's two sides of the same coin, because some work that was done by a mate of mine, Professor Slade Jensen at Western Sydney, well, he was one of a group of people that did this work. They showed that one of these bugs, a thing called vancomycin-resistant enterococci, VRE, classic fecal oral, believe it or not, and it was going through an intensive care unit. And they didn't intend to show how it was being transmitted. They were just tracking what's called the genetic serotypes of the bug. And they were doing VAN A versus VAN B frequencies and so forth and looking at. But what they effectively showed in one of the papers they published in an international journal was that they could track the bug from patients, not via the healthcare workers, but via the pieces of equipment that were being used. And there was literally weeks between the transmission points where they can show the transmission. And in some cases, it went via another patient, or it went, but at the midpoint, they went and they took out all this equipment and they found all these bugs, did all the genetics. And even after they got rid of it all and cleaned it, they still found people were getting the bugs, all this time later, because they're moving around on surfaces.
So getting back to the 20 touches.
Yeah, sorry.
You're saying, it could have just been the cart that they have that they put their notes on and, put the drugs on. And
we published another great paper called Finding the Bad Bugs in a Busy ICU.
And on that cliffhanger, we now cut to the credits rolling up the screen, and you realise that you will have to wait an entire year to catch the sequel. In the second half of the interview, we will really start to get our hands dirty, metaphorically speaking, hear about hospitals, public toilets, restaurants and cafes, as the doc blows away hand-washing myths and more. This is the episode you can't afford to miss.